Okay, let's dive in. So, welcome. Richard Knudson here, and got a good turnout today. Appreciate everybody taking the time to attend the Convergence 2012 highlights webinar. For those of you, if you don't know, I run the dynamic CRM practice at a company in beautiful Wheaton, Illinois called Magenium Solutions. My blog's the dynamiccrmtrickbag.com, corporate website magenium.com, and this is my unabashedly dynamic CRM centric summary of the goings on at the recent Convergence 2012 conference that Microsoft has in Houston. If you're not familiar with Convergence, which I suspect most of you probably are, but it's the Microsoft's big annual show for all their dynamic product lines. So not just dynamic CRM, also the ERP products, but this is my CRM centric version. What I want to do today is really just give you my perspective on the most important announcements at the show from the standpoint of dynamic CRM, the importance and timing of upcoming deliveries. There's a lot of upcoming features that I suspect a lot of you will be interested in, and talk some about how they'll be delivered. That's no longer such an obvious question. We have some of the more important components and new feature functionality that Microsoft delivers is in the form of solutions in the marketplace. So we'll talk about that too. But before we dive in, just out of curiosity, I like these polls. They do make these meetings a little bit more interesting, if only for me. Just out of curiosity, how many people actually attended the Convergence conference in Houston this year? Good. So it looks like a big, at least a plurality, a majority is no, which is, for those of you that did attend, after this presentation, I'm curious to see how your recollection of events correlates with mine. But so that's good. Thank you. Go back to the deck here. Okay, so this would not be a Convergence summary if I didn't start off with at least one marketing slide. I don't have too many marketing slides in the deck here. And by the way, I will make the deck available to attendees afterwards. But this is probably a marketing slide with some substance. Dynamic CRM does have a ton of momentum in the marketplace. That 30% revenue growth year over year, it's doubling the business every 3 years. It's definitely one of Microsoft's fastest growing products, and it's definitely one of the CRM industry's fastest growing products. There's no question about that. Okay, remember to mute. I will occasionally mute everybody. Oh, and Nick, you could do that too. I think you could keep an eye on. I promoted you to a presenter as well. But that's as much as I'm going to say about that, because Microsoft does a very good job marketing their products. What I want to do as an organizational technique for this this presentation is I'm going to piggyback on the big trends, the Uber trends, customer relationship management that Dennis Michaelis, who is the GM of the Microsoft Dynamics CRM business, used for his CRM keynote at Convergence. So I want to talk about big data analytics, the increasing importance of social in customer relationship management, the migration to the cloud, which is obviously across all different categories in IT services, no question about that. And then the importance of the mobile form factor to the user experience in CRM. So those are kind of the big categories that I'll use to organize what we talk about. And in particular, what I want to do is I want to sort of lay out how I think the big trends, those trends, map to dynamic CRM features. So we'll bring this down into the concrete here. One thing about the current regime on the dynamic CRM team is that this new 6-month service upgrade cycle, it definitely makes planning easier. This is a real explicit redirection on the part of the team in terms of these Q2 and Q4 service updates, these smaller, more frequent updates, rather than kind of the 3-year big monolithic product cycle like we saw from Dynamic CRM 3 to Dynamic CRM 4. So we are probably about here, I would say, in the current cycle. So in the November 2011 service update, we saw some pretty significant feature additions, activity feeds, charting enhancements, some behind the scenes but important enhancements with business processes, workflows, and dialogues. And in the Q2 2012, the upcoming release, we're going to see a bunch more. And this is primarily what we'll be talking about, what I want to talk about in this session. So it's kind of think you can also sort of think of this as planning for the Q2 release. Q4, we have some ideas about what's going to be in the Q4 2012 service update. They're obviously a little bit more speculative, and I will talk about some of those. But the Q2 2012 release is pretty much baked in terms of what functionality we can expect, and that's primarily where I'll focus here. So the big announcement at the show was, at least from the CRM standpoint, was that the service update, actually this is the first service update that I can remember that actually has three different ways people refer to it. The marketing name is the CRM Anywhere release. Q2 2012 service update, I believe, is the technical name. Also referred to kind of a code name that R8. Significant core feature updates, and importantly, some of the functionality you'll see delivered in the form of marketplace solutions. And that's relatively new. I believe activity feeds was really the first time we saw that. And I think it does kind of give us a glimpse into a little bit of unbundling that's going to start, we'll start to see going forward as new components are delivered in solutions that you have the option of importing rather than in the core feature set. So that's kind of where we're going today. And let me start with the big data. There's one question in the queue. And Jerry says audio is breaking up badly, and I'm not really sure. Anybody else having audio problems? Nick, can you hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, I think I'm not sure what I can do about audio problems, Jennifer. Sorry about that, but I can tell you that the recording and the audio that I'm doing locally, that will okay. I think Jerry, it may just be on your end because everybody else seems to be okay with it. But the good news is the quality of the audio on the recording will be crystal clear. So, big data. What do we mean by big data? Well, there's a couple of aspects to this, and one of them, certainly performance and scalability for very large data sets. That's more a SQL Server story than it is a CRM story. Obviously, Dynamics CRM uses SQL as the backend, and SQL 2012 is now out, so it's become a SQL 2012 story, and it's a pretty good one. SQL is certainly a database that can handle very large data sets. CRM Online, interestingly enough, is now powered by SQL 2012, so it's rolled out in the data centers. And I'm not going to say too much about this because it's not that interesting to recite a bunch of TPC benchmarks and things like that. But I do have some links, and I'll actually, if you checked out the trick bag right now, you'd see I published an article this morning that has all the links that I'll be referring to throughout the course of this presentation. That's one of them here. But what I will talk a fair amount about is the BI and the analytics aspect of this. So there's a couple of important new announcements at Convergence. Power View, if any of you remember, you code name acolytes there. Crescent was the Microsoft code name for what became Power View, which is a component of SQL 2012. It's complementary to reporting services, and I believe it's going to be exposed through a SharePoint piece of functionality. And to just say what that's going to be, it's the next generation BI tool for interactive data exploration, visualization, and presentation. And I'm reading that bullet point. I haven't worked much with Power View yet, but I've worked a fair amount with Power Pivot. And there's going to be, needless to say, a fair amount of similarity between the features. And Power Pivot has been out for a while. And I'm going to give you a glimpse of that in a minute. The components that are going to be delivered as part of the service update, here's what we get from the roadmap. This is what Microsoft says is going to be in there. It's a set of Excel workbooks with Power Pivot models and Power View report templates. So these are going to be available in the marketplace, and there's 4 specific scenarios that are going to be delivered. So product sales and sales pipeline analysis, and then customer care trends, customer demographics analysis, and these are going to be extensible. So these are models presumably based on the, an uncustomized dynamic CRM database structure. I suspect what the Power Pivot models and Power View report templates are going to do are going to basically create sort of the analytical structure, the cubes and so on, to give you sort of advanced BI and analytics against an underlying dynamic CRM database. Now, those are not available now, but I suspect some of this stuff is going to be coming out in the form of Dynamics lab solutions even before the Q2 2012 update is delivered. So I'll show you where to look for things like this. I check not daily now, but it won't be long before I start checking daily, because I suspect some of those are going to be sooner rather than later. There is a problem. I think the big data story is one of these areas where the feature set parity between Dynamic CRM Online and Dynamic CRM On-Premise is not nearly as good as it is most of these different areas for Dynamic CRM. Dynamic CRM Online definitely has a lot of limitations compared to the on-premise. Not architecture. The architecture is the same. The way you customize it is the same. The data structure is the same. But you don't have access to the SQL database. That's the main constraint. So you cannot perform the optimization techniques. So any of the things that you might do to optimize a very large SQL database for an on-prem CRM, you don't really have access. You don't have the hooks into the database in the CRM Online, the cloud version. There are some other limitations that are even for me more these are more binding constraints. And I think this second class, things like can't do SQL queries against filter views. You need to use fetch XML, and fetch XML, it's got a 10,000 row limit in the kinds of queries you can do, and there's no real practical way to get around that in the pure online scenario. So your all cloud options are pretty limited when it comes to CRM Online. And a couple of other ways you can see this. Power Pivot, we'll look at this next, but Power Pivot and Power View do not support Windows Live authentication. And live authentication is what we use for CRM Online. So you can't use those tools to directly query or do analytics against CRM Online database. That's not something that's going to be added in the Q2 2012 service update as far as we know. That looks like it's going to happen at some point, but my guess is maybe next fall. But I'll show you this in a real concrete way in the demo. You'll be able to see that. So for CRM Online, you don't really have an all-cloud option unless you go with Azure. Now, I haven't done much work with that, but Azure databases are supported. Azure SQL databases are supported for Power View and Power Pivot, so that may work. But what you typically have to do is sync to an on-premise SQL. So this sort of a hybrid cloud. So if you want to do real business intelligence kind of analytics work against a CRM Online database right now, you're going to do something like replicate the data down to a local SQL database that's behind your firewall, and then you would be able to do your structured analysis with SSRS, or ad hoc analysis with things like Power Pivot or Power View. So you won't be able to do direct analytics up against CRM Online. Now, arguably, some people would say, well, that's okay, because you shouldn't be doing analytics against a production database in the first place. But a lot of the things that you do with Power Pivot, you can certainly do Power Pivot and Power View models that don't burn a lot of cycles in the production database. So it would be nice to be able to go up directly against the production database for some scenarios. But that's not something that we'll see in the short term. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you, if you haven't seen Power Pivot yet, it is something that that system administrators, developers, customizers, power users, I suspect, will be getting familiar with, because it's a very good analytical tool. It sounds like it might just be like Excel, but it solves a lot of problems that you can't do just with, say, pivot tables in Excel. And this will also be a good way for you to get to know DAX. So DAX, the data analysis expressions, is sort of a library of functions specifically for working with data, slicers and other things like that. So let me show you. And again, the importance of this for the Q2 2012 release is that the marketplace, and we'll look at the marketplace before the session is over, will contain pre-configured models. I'm going to create a model from scratch in Power Pivot to do this, but let me show you why you might want to do this. I'm going to look at analytics records. These are click dimensions analytics records. So if you've read some of my blog posts, you might be aware that I really like it's an add-on tool called Click Dimensions that does email marketing, marketing automation, and analytics. So that is web page views and visits to websites, things like that. And the interesting thing about this and why I like it in CRM is because it ties those activities back to contact records. So what we're looking at here is two different visualizations of the same underlying data set. So this is page views on my blog for the last 30 days. About 8,000 a week, about 4,000 so far this week. And then that's by week and then by day down at the bottom. So that's nice, 30 days. Okay, so what happens if I try to go and look at all page views by week for 2012? Right? How many of you have seen this before? Right? So this is a real good illustration of, sort of the problems with just the pure BI. Not that this is sophisticated analytics here, but the fact that I can't go back more than, it's just that not much ability in the native charting engine here to really display or do much with really what is not a very big data set. So what I want to do is give you a quick peek at Power Pivot. So I'll go into Excel. This is Excel 2010. And Power Pivot is a free add-on for Excel. And when you add it on, you can open a Power Pivot window. So here we are in Power Pivot, and a good way to see the limitations of analytics for the CRM online scenario is here. If I try to connect up to a SQL Server database, notice the only forms of authentication we have is Windows and SQL Server. There's no live authentication mechanism here. So I can't go up against my CRM online database, and I spent a lot of time trying to find out a definitive answer to that, and it's surprisingly hard to get I finally found somebody at Microsoft who would confirm that is not supported yet. So you can't go directly up against a CRM online database with something like Power Pivot or Power View, but you can go against lots of different data sources. So what I have here is just a staged Access database. So for demo purposes, Access is playing the role of what would probably be a SQL database in a kind of a more production environment, but this works fine. And I'm going to go and hook up to I'm going to use this Click Dimensions Analytics, the CD Analytics database that I've got locally. And I'll select from a list of tables and views. And what I'm going to do is I've got this page views table in the Access database, and I'll go ahead and select that and finish out. And this is all page views on the trick bag for the first 3 months. It's through maybe April 1st, somewhere around in there, earlier this week. So this is basically 3 months worth of data. It's about 120,000 page views in that period of time. So again, this is not a huge data set by any stretch, but it definitely illustrates some of the advantages of analytics, and it'll also illustrate kind of the approach that you could take to do this if you do have a dynamic CRM online or on-premise database. But this is really the only practical approach for online, is to stage this. Now, you can kind of tell, even if you aren't that familiar with the way that Click Dimension stores page views, you can kind of see what's going on. We can see every page view. So I've got 120,000 records here. Every page view, we know which IP organization it originated from, if it's associated with a lead or a contact record. Again, that's the advantage of having this in CRM in the first place, is Click Dimensions can tie page views back to those customer records. Get which page was viewed, what type, is it a page, a landing page, a survey, form, that sort of thing. What's the viewed on date? That's an important one. Click Dimensions has a configurable scoring mechanism you can use to score a visit. Which browser, operating system, is associated with the campaign, and some things like the referrer type. Referrer type is kind of interesting, and that would be something like, did it come from direct traffic? Somebody type in the links. Was it a search engine result? Was it from a social media site? That sort of thing. And what you might be tempted to do if you're used to Excel pivot tables is simply create a pivot table and start doing things like looking at page views by week and things like that. But Power Pivot doesn't work quite like that. You have to create your measures in here. So what I'm going to do is create a couple of calculated columns. You can refer to these as measures. And I'm going to base this on, I'm going to use these. This is a DAX function, and this is data analysis expression. So this whole function library, I'm not going to do much that looks different from what you'd think of as Excel functions, because I've got some pretty simple requirements here. Plus, I don't want you to have to watch me type too much. But there are some interesting functions you can use with DAX to get some pretty good time series analysis and things like that. So what I want to do is extract the year from the viewed on date. And I'll rename the column, give it a better name. Cleverly, I choose year. Then I want the week, and I'm going to use the week num function. Then I'll use this kind of square bracket notation, probably somewhat familiar to you. Again, that would be pretty similar to how you'd work with functions in like a table or pivot table in Excel. I'm going to give this a better name. Oops, if I can find it. There we go. I'll call this week. So now I've got year and week. And I want to do one other one. If I scroll over here to the contact column, you can see that I've got a fair number of page views that Click Dimensions has associated with a contact record, but a lot of them are anonymous. The bulk of them are anonymous, not surprising. And what I want is I want a way of easily filtering on a page view that's from a contact or is anonymous. And what I can do is use an if expression for that. So I'm going to say if the length of a field in here, how about contact, if that's greater than 0, then I'm going to call this contact. Otherwise, this is going to be an empty string. And at first it looks like it didn't work, but you'll see that it did in a second. I'm going to give this a better name, and what I would call this is contact. How about that? And you'll see in a minute, that gives me, I can get some interesting analytics from this once I start really working with this data. So now I've got my model effectively completed. Now I can start doing the pivots. And I'm going to do a pivot chart. So I've got the underlying data hooked up. And I'll increase the size of this a little bit. There we go. Now what I want is I want basically counts of page views out here. So I'm going to drag the ID, access creates an ID, and the sum of those things is not a very, that might make me feel good if I thought that was the number of page views, but it wouldn't give me a very accurate representation because that should be a count. So I change that to a count, and this isn't very interesting either because I already knew I had that many records in there because that's what I limited to. I'm going to get rid of the legend, and I'll give this a better title. So here's page views. But now what we want to do is get some category fields. And probably the most interesting one, how about week? That was that measure that we created. So if I drag week, drag that and drop that onto the axis or the category fields, that becomes a little bit more interesting. And now I can already see something that I couldn't see, with the charting, the native charting tools in CRM, just because it can't display that much data. I'll drag year down as a report filter so I can filter out this week 53 from last year. So let's use this select multiple items trick to deselect 2011. So now this is getting kind of interesting. And this isn't much more than I could do in any number of places, but one of the things that we'll take a look at now is I can take advantage of some nice features. These are specifically Power Pivot features to do things like insert slicers. These slicers are pretty cool. What they do is give you the ability to interactively filter on a chart or a pivot table. And now that I've got these, let me disappear the field list in a second. I'm going to get browser. I want to look at the operating system. Want to look at whether the page view is from a contact. And I might want to look at something like referrer type. So now that I've got those slicers, let me size things a little bit better here. Just lay this out. If you haven't worked with slicers before, I remember the first time I started working with these, I thought it was a little bit confusing, but then you get used to them, and they're actually quite useful for things that you'd think of as kind of option set values in dynamic CRM, right? These are mutually exclusive values, and I can filter on them interactively. So look at the browser. Interesting thing about this, we've got Android, but then we've got mobile browsers, and we've got PC browsers. So Android, iPad, and iPhone. If I filter on one of those, get a few page views from served up to Android devices. Then we choose iPads and iPhones, and so I can extend. So you can kind of you can sort of mix and match with these filter values. And one of the things you can see, even though there's not a lot of data here, but it's probably enough. I'd say this is probably a relatively clear trend. So we're getting increasing traffic from those mobile devices, which is kind of interesting. You can use the referrer type too. Notice that, or the operating system. Let's just use mobile. Right? That's basically the same trend. So kind of cross-check the browser slicer against the OS slicer to see how that works. Now, not surprisingly, Windows is by far most of the traffic I get. Fair amount of Linux traffic, some Mac, and increasingly fair amount of mobile traffic. But that's sort of just interesting. I guess as that trend increases, I probably want to come up with a version that's optimized for those devices. Now, what I want to do here, though, is I'm going to show you something that might be even a little bit more interesting. I'm going to get rid of everything except the contact slicer, because there's a couple things I think are interesting to do analytics on for how page views from contacts are different from all page views. So if I just do this, if I slice on is contact or not, you see what I'm doing here? So you can tell it's a minority, a small chunk of my page views are from contacts. So the most I ever had in a day is maybe 340 or something. Most are anonymous, but you can tell, you can probably guess if you checked your inboxes, some of you if you get my emails, these are the weeks that I sent out email blasts. So I get a big spike in contact page views every time I send out an email blast, which isn't too surprising because it's easy for Click Dimensions to track those. But what I want to do now is let's get rid of the week as the category field, and now I want to drop the page title down here. So this is all the page views over the time period for all page views here, distributed across all pages. Not a very interesting view. But I can select the category axis here, choose the sort and filter option, and let's sort this in descending order by count of ID. So since this is by page, now this makes it a little bit more interesting. So this is effectively, these are the top pages on the left and going down. Now still not too digestible here, but if I select the axis again, and this time let's filter, and let's do a value filter for the top 10 pages by count of ID. So now we've got something that's a little bit more interesting. Let's disappear the page view, increase the size of this thing a little bit so I can read it. So the interesting thing about this to me is, so this is my top 10 pages for this time period. So this one page CRM security roles, that's pretty good. I can see why that might be of some enduring popularity. I like that one. This one mystifies me though. The CRM 2011 on-premise hardware and server or software requirements. This is a copy and paste job from the implementation guide. So, but for some reason, that articles that I spend days or days writing never get any page views. But this thing, copy and paste thing, gets always is up there in the top 10. But anyway, um, the interesting thing about this though is if I select just pages that are from contact views, then this is an entirely different picture. So people that are resolved by click dimensions as contacts in my CRM database, they don't look at the same pages for the most part. So the Convergence 2012 highlights page is a popular one over this time period, even though it's only been up a couple of weeks. Dashboard examples, something I published in December or something like that, right around the end of the year. CRM Anywhere. So now this probably isn't surprising. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But unless you have this data, you don't really know. I mean, you probably can sort of intuit this if you think about it a little bit. But these aren't things that were necessarily going to be obvious to me, without having done this analysis in the first place and being able to tie page views back to contact or lead records. I think for a lot of organizations is probably going to be a pretty important thing. So that's just a little bit on the analytics piece. Let me jump back to the deck. So you can look forward to if you don't necessarily want to develop the drill down skills and things like Power Pivot, Power View. I guess the main point from the Q2 2012 release is that you will have plenty of models that are part of pre-developed models that are going to be part of that release, and those will be available, by the way, on the marketplace. And what I'm going to do here is let me go to the blog and show you where all these links are. Let me share out to the desktop for 1 second. So just this morning I published this article, Convergence 2012 Highlights Links. This is not exactly a super interesting article from a writing standpoint, but the links are pretty good. So I just wanted one place where I have all these links. And this one in particular, where is the, here we are. This link here is a link to the Dynamics CRM Marketplace with an embedded search for things from Microsoft Dynamics Labs. So a lot of the stuff that a lot of the interesting things that we'll see coming out over the next couple of months, I suspect will first appear in this search result. So Microsoft Dynamics Labs, if you notice the online application buy, this is the Dynamics CRM team and puts these managed solutions up here. And there's some pretty interesting functionality. One of the big trends that I'm not going to talk too much about today, but certainly obvious here, is things like this, these industry templates, like the nonprofit template for Microsoft Dynamics CRM or wealth management. So those are good examples of managed solutions for, say, industry verticals. We'll start to see getting pushed out through the marketplace. Okay, so that's a little bit on the analytics piece.